Some encounters change lives forever. Others expose truths that were hiding in plain sight. Margaret Hayes didn't need much from the world these days. At 68 years old, she had lived through enough to recognize injustice before it even reached her doorstep. She had seen it in the way people clutched their purses when she passed by, in the way store clerks followed her just a little too closely, in the way certain neighbors peeked through their blinds as she strolled down the street in her Sunday best. Some things never changed, but this was different. The afternoon sun was heavy on her shoulders as she stepped out of Millie's Market, one of the last local grocery stores that hadn't been replaced by chain supermarkets. The plastic bags dug into her fingers, her back aching from years of carrying burdens that weren't hers to bear. She had just placed her groceries in the trunk of her old Buick when she heard it. A sharp, clipped whistle, not the kind meant for calling pets or greeting friends. No, this was the kind meant for control. "Ma'am." Margaret turned, adjusting her glasses, her brows lifting as she took in the sight of two uniformed police officers striding toward her. One was tall, built like a linebacker, his mirrored sunglasses hiding his expression. The other was younger, jittery, the kind of rookie who still hadn't figured out when to trust his instincts. "Need to see some ID," the taller officer said, his voice heavy with the expectation of immediate obedience. Margaret frowned. "Excuse me?" "Routine check," the rookie added, though his voice lacked conviction. "We got a report about suspicious activity in the area." Suspicious. Margaret had lived in this neighborhood longer than some of these houses had stood, and yet, here she was. Margaret's fingers tightened around the strap of her purse, the weight of their words pressing against her like the humid Georgia air. Suspicious activity. The phrase hung in the space between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. She had heard those words before. When she was 16, walking home from Bible study, and an officer stopped her, claiming she fit the description. When she was 38, pulled over for a broken taillight that wasn't broken. When she was 54, mistaken for a housekeeper in her own home. Now, at 68, after a lifetime of being told she didn't belong, she was still standing in front of two men with badges, demanding to know why she dared exist in a place that should have felt like home. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. "And what activity might that be?" she asked, her voice smooth but firm. The taller cop squared his shoulders. "Just show us some ID, and we'll be on our way." A flicker of something old and unshaken burned in Margaret's chest. She had spent years taming that fire, forcing herself to swallow her indignation, to pick her battles carefully. But today, standing in a nearly empty parking lot, with the last bit of afternoon light stretching long shadows across the asphalt, she felt something shift inside her. "You see my car. You see my groceries. What exactly do you think I've done?" she pressed. The taller officer smirked. "Just following procedures, ma'am." "Procedures for what?" "Existing." His expression hardened. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to cooperate. And I need you to tell me what crime I've committed." Silence. The rookie shifted uncomfortably, as if suddenly realizing that this wasn't as routine as he had been led to believe. But the taller officer, he had already made up his mind. Margaret let out a slow breath, rolling her shoulders back like she was settling in for a conversation she had already rehearsed 100 times over. "Let me get this straight," she said, adjusting her glasses as she looked from one officer to the other. "I'm standing in a grocery store parking lot, bags of oranges and canned soup in my trunk, and you two grown men with badges and guns are out here treating me like I just robbed a bank." The rookie shifted on his feet, looking like he wanted to melt into the asphalt. The taller officer, though, he still had that smug, immovable expression, the kind of look that said he wasn't used to being questioned. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying that patronizing weight of authority, "this doesn't have to be difficult." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I agree. It doesn't. You could just apologize for wasting my time and be on your way." That flicker of frustration in the officer's eyes, oh, she caught it. She had spent a lifetime recognizing that look, the look men like him got when they realized they weren't in control of the conversation anymore. The rookie cleared his throat, "Ma'am, we're just doing our job." Margaret let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "Honey, if this is your job, y'all might want to start looking for a new one. I've been coming to this store since before you were old enough to drive. I probably taught half the people in this neighborhood how to tie their shoes. So why don't you tell me exactly what part of me looks suspicious? Is it the flowered blouse, the orthopedic sneakers? Or is it the fact that I'm a black woman standing in the wrong place at the wrong time?" The taller officer's jaw tightened. His fingers twitched near his radio. There it was, the unspoken warning, the "do as I say or this is going to get ugly" moment. Margaret had seen it too many times before, but this time she was ready. She reached into her purse, not for her ID, for something far more powerful. Margaret didn't rush. Oh no, she had learned a long time ago that sudden movements made people like these officers nervous. Instead, she moved with the kind of slow, deliberate grace that only came from decades of knowing exactly how to handle situations like this. She reached into her purse not for her ID, but for something much more powerful, her phone. The rookie tensed immediately, his eyes darting to her hands like she'd just pulled out a live grenade. The taller officer's lips curled slightly, like he was about to tell her that calling someone wasn't going to change anything. Oh, but it would. Margaret scrolled through her contacts with the same kind of ease she used when flipping through church programs on Sunday morning. She tapped a name, then held the phone to her ear, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Who are you calling?" the taller officer asked, his confidence faltering just the slightest bit. Margaret didn't answer. She didn't need to. The line rang once, twice, then. A voice, sharp, professional, the kind of voice that made people sit up straight when they heard it. Margaret's smile widened. "Hey, baby," she said, her tone light, casual, like she wasn't standing in the middle of a grocery store parking lot being interrogated for existing. "I seem to be having a little trouble here." The taller officer shifted, his smirk flickering like a weak light bulb about to burn out. "Ma'am, we..." Margaret held up a single finger, silencing him. "Mum," she continued into the phone, "couple of officers stopped me. Asking for ID, no real reason given." A pause. Then the voice on the other end sharpened. "Where are you?" Margaret turned slightly, watching as the officers exchanged a glance. Oh, now they were nervous. "Just outside Harper's Market," she replied, letting the words settle in the thick summer air. Silence, then a clipped, professional response from the other end of the line. "Stay put." Margaret slipped her phone back into her purse and clasped it shut with the ease of a woman who had just put the final move in a chess match she had been winning all along. "Oh, I will." For the first time that day, neither officer had a thing to say. The taller officer's confidence wavered for the first time. His smirk, so smug just moments ago, had all but disappeared. He cleared his throat, shifting his stance like a man who suddenly realized he might have just stepped into the wrong fight. Who was that?" he asked, trying to sound in control, but there was something else in his voice now. Something close to doubt. Margaret adjusted the strap on her purse, taking her sweet time before answering. She wanted them to sweat a little. Then, with a voice as steady as a judge's gavel, she said, "My daughter." A flicker of confusion crossed their faces. "And what does your daughter do?" the rookie asked hesitantly, almost as if he was afraid of the answer. Margaret gave him a long, slow look, the kind of look that mothers gave when they were about to teach a hard lesson. "She's the United States Attorney General." The words hit like a hammer. The taller officer stiffened, his lips parting slightly like a man who had just realized he had walked straight off a cliff and there was no ground beneath him. The rookie, poor thing, he swallowed so hard his Adam's apple practically jumped. His eyes flickered between Margaret and his partner, silently asking, "Did we just mess up?" Margaret adjusted her glasses and smiled, sweet, patient, like a grandmother who had just watched two kids get caught with their hands in the cookie jar. "Now, officers," she said, her voice cool, controlled, with just the slightest hint of amusement, "would you like to see my ID? Or would you rather wait for my daughter to arrive?" Silence. For the first time that day, the officers looked like they didn't know what to do. And Margaret, she just stood there, watching, waiting, enjoying every second of it. The silence between Margaret and the officers stretched uncomfortably. The taller cop, whose face had been set in stone just moments ago, now seemed to be calculating. The rookie, he was already sweating bullets. His fingers twitched at his sides, like he wasn't sure if he should stand firm or start sprinting for the horizon. Margaret, on the other hand, was perfectly still, not afraid, not panicked, just watching. "Ma'am," the taller officer started, clearing his throat like a man trying to backpedal without making it obvious. "We're just doing our job." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Oh. And what job is that exactly?" The officer squared his shoulders again, as if trying to reclaim whatever authority had just slipped from his grasp. "Making sure everything checks out." Margaret let out a quiet chuckle, one that wasn't amused, but full of understanding. The kind of laugh that said, "I've seen this before. I've seen you before." "Well," she said, adjusting the strap of her purse, "I suppose we'll see if everything checks out when my daughter gets here." A muscle ticked in the taller officer's jaw. The rookie's eyes darted around like he was searching for an escape hatch in the pavement. "You don't have to call anyone," the taller cop said, his tone shifting from hard authority to something just a little too forced, like he was trying to smooth over a situation he had only just realized was spiraling. "Too late. I already did." Margaret didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The power of her words alone sent a ripple through the air, making the officer stand a little straighter, a little more uncertain. The taller officer licked his lips. "Ma'am, look, we weren't." "You were," Margaret cut in smoothly, "and you still are." A few feet away, a small crowd had started to gather. The grocery store had always been a place where neighbors ran into one another, where conversations stretched out longer than they should. But now, the energy was different. People had stopped pushing their carts. An older black man in a plaid button-up stood with his arms crossed, watching. A young mother held her child's hand tightly, shaking her head. A cashier in an apron peered from behind the glass doors. The officers noticed, too. The rookie took a half step back, suddenly hyper-aware of how many eyes were now fixed on them. The taller officer, though, he wasn't ready to back down completely, not yet. He turned toward the growing crowd, offering them a tight, almost rehearsed smile. "Folks, there's nothing to see here. Please, go about your day." Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The weight of the moment hung over them like the pressure in the air before a storm. Then, the sound of a car approaching, fast. And Margaret, she just smiled, waiting for the show to begin. The sleek black sedan pulled up so fast it was almost like it had materialized out of thin air. The hum of the engine sliced through the thick summer air, and when the door swung open, the officers took a step back. Instinct, maybe, or fear. Stepping out of the car was a woman who didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. Tall, poised, dressed in a navy blue suit that looked sharp enough to cut steel. Her presence swallowed the entire parking lot. She shut the door with a deliberate click and took a slow step forward, scanning the scene like a prosecutor about to dismantle a case in court. Her eyes sharp, piercing, the same deep brown as Margaret's locked onto the officers with the kind of intensity that made grown men reconsider their life choices. "Which one of you put your hands on my mother?" Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the weight of someone who had spent their life commanding rooms, making men in expensive suits sweat, and turning weak excuses into career-ending scandals. The taller officer, already shaken, stiffened. "No one put their hands on her," he said quickly, stepping back. His posture a stark contrast to the authority he had tried to wield just minutes ago. "Good," she took another step forward, "because if you had, we'd be having a very different conversation right now." The rookie swallowed so hard Margaret could almost hear it. The taller cop, though he was still trying. He was like a man clinging to a sinking ship, refusing to believe the water had already reached his chin. "Look," he started, his voice losing its edge. "We didn't know who she was." Margaret's daughter, United States Attorney General Camille Hayes, tilted her head slightly. Her expression didn't change, but the shift in her body language was enough to send another jolt of panic through the officers. "I'm sorry. What?" The officer hesitated. We didn't know. So what you're telling me," Camille said, her voice like a blade being drawn from its sheath, "is that if my mother wasn't my mother, if she was just another black woman minding her business, you would have treated her differently? Is that what you're saying?" The taller officer opened his mouth, closed it. He had nowhere to go. Camille didn't wait for him to answer. She turned slightly, scanning the small crowd that had gathered. "How many of you know my mother?" she asked, her voice carrying without effort. A chorus of voices responded almost immediately. "She's been here longer than anybody. She taught at the elementary school for decades. Everybody knows Miss Margaret. She watched my kids when I had to work late." Camille turned back to the officers. These people, they knew who she was. "And yet, you didn't. You assumed. You harassed her. And now what? You want to explain it away. Pretend it's just a misunderstanding." Neither officer said a word. Camille took another step closer, her voice dropping just enough to make them lean in. "Let me tell you something," she said. "I have spent my entire career holding men like you accountable. I know every law, every policy, every loophole you think you can hide behind. And if you think for 1 second that this ends with you walking away without consequences." She let the sentence hang there, unfinished. But it didn't need finishing. The promise of what came next was enough. The taller officer straightened like he was about to protest, but Camille had already turned away from him. She faced Margaret now, her expression softening in a way it only ever did for her mother. "You okay, Mama?" Margaret, who had remained still and patient throughout the entire ordeal, let out a small, knowing smile. "I'm fine, baby," she said, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's arm. "Just tired." Camille exhaled through her nose, a controlled breath that barely concealed the storm simmering beneath the surface. She nodded once, then turned back to the officers. "You two," she said, her voice crisp and businesslike, "are going to hand over your badge numbers and full names right now. And then you're going to go back to your department and let them know that this," she gestured between them, "is far from over." The rookie, he didn't hesitate. He scrambled to pull out a notepad, scribbled down his information so fast he nearly tore the paper, and handed it over with both hands like he was offering up a peace treaty. The taller officer, he hesitated. Just a fraction too long. Camille didn't flinch. "I will make one phone call and have your entire precinct on their knees before sunset." "Do you really want to test that?" The man's lips pressed into a thin line. His jaw worked, his pride clearly waging war against common sense. But in the end, common sense won. He pulled out his own notepad and, much more slowly, wrote down his information before handing it over. Camille took both papers, tucking them into her pocket like they were nothing more than receipts from a bad transaction. Then, without another glance at the officers, she turned back to Margaret. "Let's go home, Mama." And just like that, it was over, or at least, for now, because by the time they reached Margaret's modest brick home, with its weathered porch swing and flower beds she had tended for decades, Camille's phone was already vibrating nonstop. Texts, emails, calls, people who knew people. People who had already heard. People who wanted statements. Margaret watched her daughter move through the room, fielding messages, strategizing before she had even taken off her blazer. She had seen Camille in work mode before, but never like this, never when the fight was personal. By the next morning, the city was awake before the sun. The story had spread like wildfire, traveling from social media to national news before most people had even poured their first cup of coffee. A bystander's video capturing every moment of the grocery store encounter had gone viral overnight. It showed everything. The way the officers approached Margaret, the way she stood her ground. The moment Camille arrived and turned the tables with nothing but her presence and her words. Now, outside the police department, people were gathering. Not yet protesting, but standing together watching, waiting, making it clear that this wasn't just another headline that would disappear in a 24-hour news cycle. Inside Margaret's home, she sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee. Across from her, Camille was in full strategist mode, sending emails, making calls, drafting statements like a general preparing for battle. Margaret reached out, resting a hand on her daughter's wrist. The movement was small, but it was enough to make Camille pause. "Baby," Margaret said gently, "you don't have to fight every war alone." Camille sighed, rubbing her temple. "Mama, this isn't just about you. It's bigger than that. How many times has this happened to people who don't have a daughter in my position? How many times has no one been there to stop it?" Margaret nodded slowly. "I know, and I love that you're fighting. But just remember, winning isn't just about making noise. It's about making change." Camille exhaled, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. Margaret smiled, squeezing her daughter's hand. "You're doing the right thing, baby. Just make sure you do it the right way." Outside, the hum of voices grew louder as more people arrived at the police station. The weight of the moment was clear. This wasn't just about one woman in a parking lot. It was about all the people who had been stopped, questioned, and dismissed without reason. And this time, the ending would not be written by the same hands that had always held the pen. A knock at the door. Camille turned, her expression unreadable as she opened it. Standing on the porch was a man in a crisp suit, his badge clipped to his belt. Behind him, two officers lingered near the curb, their gazes fixed on anything but the front door. Margaret didn't need an introduction to know who he was. Attorney General Hayes, the man greeted. His voice was measured, controlled, the sound of someone sent to contain a situation that had already slipped beyond his grasp. Camille nodded once. "Chief Reynolds." The police chief cleared his throat. "May I come in?" Camille stepped aside. The chief hesitated before entering, as if stepping into this house meant acknowledging a truth he had long ignored. He took a seat at the kitchen table, hands folded, carefully choosing his words. "I reviewed the footage," he admitted, his tone tight. It was unacceptable. Margaret studied him, her face unreadable. Camille crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. "That's the word we're going with?" she asked. The chief's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Yes, and I want you to know we're taking action. The officers involved have been placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation." Camille exhaled, shaking her head. "That's the bare minimum." The chief met her gaze, something in his expression shifting. "I know," Margaret finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "I've heard apologies before, Chief." The room was silent. Then, Camille leaned forward. "This can't just be about two officers," she said. "You and I both know they're not the only ones. How many more complaints have been ignored? How many more reports have been buried?" The chief hesitated. Margaret took a slow sip of her coffee, then set the mug down with a soft clink. "If you want to fix this, Chief, don't just put a band-aid on a bullet wound. Change the system that keeps letting it happen." The chief sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "We're working on it." Camille raised an eyebrow, "Then work faster." A long pause stretched between them. Then, finally, the chief stood. "You'll have my statement by the end of the day," he promised. Camille stepped aside, letting him leave. The door shut behind him with a soft click. Margaret sat back, watching her daughter carefully. "You think he meant it?" she asked. Camille let out a slow breath. "I don't know. But if he doesn't, we'll make sure he does." Margaret smiled. "That's my girl." Because this time, they weren't just demanding justice, they were making sure it lasted.